right, so Martin Keller, welcome and thank you for presenting to Minnesota MUFON on the Space Pen Club. Martin Keller is a former pop culture journalist, published author, and unproduced screenplay writer whose work has appeared in Rolling Stone, Leaders, The Washington Post, The Boston Globe, Final Frontier, Billboard, Utne Reader, Right On, The Star Tribune, the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal, City Pages, and others, with appearances on Today, 48 Hours, PBS, Public Radio, and more. Keller has also written Hijinks and Hearsay, Scenester Stories from Minnesota's Pop Life. For the past 25 years, he's worked as an award-winning public relations pro, including an adventurous stint with the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, CSETI. The Space Pen Club is based in part on that period. Minnesota MUFON, please welcome Mr. Martin Keller. Take it away, Martin. They're all applauding, but they're all muted, so you can't hear them applauding. It's all applauding for them. So,
all right. Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to work off notes, so if you see me looking down, I'm not dozing off. Hopefully you're not either. So I am going to share about a dozen slides as I move through my presentation. Then I'll do a brief reading from the Space Pen Club, only a few pages. I always think that readings are a little bit unnecessary and maybe redundant if you've read the book. If you haven't, I always think questions are of greater value than listening to an author read his own stuff. That said, I have picked out, I think, 3 or 4 pages from chapter 9 of the book, and I'll talk more about that as we get closer to that segment of the presentation. I'm going to share this first slide here. Hopefully everyone can see that. Wave your hand if you can't, because I'm somewhat of a Luddite when it comes to modern technology. My kids are my go-to IT people, and none of them are in the house today, so I have to rely on the group effort here. Space Pen Club, full title, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, UFO Disclosure, Consciousness, and Other Mind Zoomers, An Insider's Tale, A Personal Odyssey. Probably the longest title of a UFO book you'll ever see, although, as you'll hopefully understand, the book is not entirely about UFOs. It touches on any number of things from media to government disclosure issues and other facets of this amazing topic. I started writing this book about 10 years ago. It took me about 18 months to really figure out what I wanted to say in the book. I set it aside for a couple of years, which was, in retrospect, probably a good thing, because the book was released about 2 weeks before that government report landed on June 25th this summer, and we'll get into that later. When I set out writing the book, I didn't really see the book I had in mind as having been written before. I mean, there's tons of really good UFO books, there's tons of really bad UFO books, and you've probably read a bit of both. But I've never really read a book that gets into the subculture of the whole UFO genre. I mean, in this book, you're going to meet UFO researchers and their debunkers, individuals from the Avery, and I assume most of you might know what the Avery is, kind of an ad hoc collection of mostly guys from aerospace, military intelligence units, scientists interested in parapsychology, paranormal, and psi phenomena. There's also close interactions with media types and government officials, celebrated astronauts like Apollo astronaut Ed Mitchell, Brian O'Leary, who was slated for the Mars program until it was scrubbed, and Native American medicine men. Of course, there's a few flakes in this book, and many other fascinating people and ideas that I encountered along the way in my whole UFO journey. Now, I want to go to the next slide. Hopefully everyone can see that. Slide 2, the cover of the book. As I write in the promotional materials for this book, the world is hopefully witnessing the big thaw about the UFO UAP subject in the mainstream media now, the military and in government. So the Spaceman Club is really a timely historical, cultural, and personal memoir that takes readers on hopefully a compelling journey that provides fresh insights into how we got to this point and where we might go from here. The book looks at close encounters of the fifth kind, which is human-initiated contact with the visitors or the phenomena. It was established by Dr. Steve Greer at the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, CSETI as the acronym goes. I spent a good part of the 90s working with Dr. Greer, and I had quite a few adventures with him, and some of those are recollected in this work. But long prior to meeting Greer or even knowing about CSETI, I had two major sightings as a kid in high school, and then in an experience of what I like to call in the book radical reality. Some high strangeness events in my life that began about 6 to 8 months before I met Dr. Greer in the early 90s. And those experiences are recollected rather heavily in detail in the first two chapters. Ultimately, this book is a multi-layered story that captures the most dangerously alienated and magnificent outliers in the known universe, confronting its place in the cosmos, humanity itself. I mentioned that I've always been interested in the subject since I was a kid, really, grade school on up. In fact, as a kid, I was a total space geek. I wrote to NASA for any information they could send me on the space programs, the Gemini, Mercury, and Apollo programs, and I got back several packets of information and autographed photos of the astronauts in those programs, which I still have to this day. Some of them are in the book. This one in particular, this is Senator John Glenn, although this is a photo of him several years after his 3 orbits of the Earth back in the early 60s. I wrote to astronaut Glenn kind of out of the blue and congratulated him, and I got a personal letter from his office and an autograph photo from him. What's interesting about Glenn, and I didn't find this out until some of this disclosure stuff from the government started happening, and these New York Times stories exploded beginning on the front page beginning in 2017. And in one of those New York Times stories, Harry Reid had this to say about Glenn. Over the following years, as I became increasingly interested in UFOs, in part through my conversations with former astronaut Glenn, a fellow senator with a similar curiosity, my staff warned me not to be seen to engage on the topic. Stay the hell away from this, they said. I politely ignored them. I was inquisitive, and like Senator Glenn, I thought it was an issue that demanded attention, and I was in a position to act, and act I did. Senator Harry Reid, Nevada, the now retired Democratic senator from Nevada, and of course he's talking about being in a position to act, and the position that he was referring to, his ability to act, was establishing what was then a secret program called the Unidentified Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that a good friend of his out in Las Vegas, Nevada, entrepreneur and aerospace pioneer, commercial aerospace pioneer, Robert Bigelow, ran this program in the private sector. And of course, these New York Times stories kind of busted that out onto the front page of the Times, and subsequently influenced media everywhere to do similar stories. And I get into that pretty heavily in the book, and I'll talk more about that later. I wanted to return to my high school period. Those two handsome young men there, the one on your right is my BFF, my best friend forever, who I've known since the 5th grade, Jim Reichert, otherwise known as Zod in the book. And that's me with the Beatlesy haircut on the left, your left, I believe. Reichert and I had 2 sightings the year this picture was taken. And we grew up in western North Dakota in Dickinson, kind of on the edge of the prairie out there near the Montana state line. The week of our sightings, there were many UFO sightings reported in the western part of the state in the newspaper, broadcast, radio, and television outlets. Jim and I had a long-standing interest in UFO issues. We used to read the UFO trade press whenever we could, and we had many long discussions about it. We did our personal sky watches on occasion, but one night he and I were at a high school basketball game, middle of February, damn North Dakota cold, like 20 below zero cold, and somebody came in from outside smoking a cigarette and said, "Hey, there's a big ass UFO out over the experimental station out on the edge of town." Our high school at that point was right on the edge of town, and we rushed outside there without our coats, and we could see very clearly about a quarter of a mile away a large white object, oval shaped, pretty much just hovering. I didn't perceive, Jim doesn't remember perceiving any structure. I thought there was clearly some structure evident there, but the thing just hung there for a long time. One of the other 2 companions that we were with suggested getting in his car and going to check it out further, and I think I was the idiot who poo-pooed that idea, saying like, well, that's what everybody's been seeing all over this part of the state all week. Let's go back inside. It's cold out here. Our coats are in there, and there's a good varsity basketball game that needs to play out. But prior to this group witness sighting out there, about 3 or 4 days earlier, Jim and I were walking through the park behind his parents' house. It was called Rocky Butte Park, and it was the highest point on the landscape there. I'm sure the Native Americans have a special name for it. But from the top of the butte, as we walked to a student council meeting one night that same week, we saw a red orb about this big, about the size of a ping pong ball, and it came down from the top of the butte, and it hung in front of us for a long time. We obviously stopped in our tracks. I can't say we were afraid of it. We were more fascinated with it. You know, we didn't know what the hell it was. Jim says, "What the hell is that?" And, you know, being good Catholic boys, I responded that it was the devil because it was red. And that was the first thing that came to mind. And eventually the thing just disappeared, but you know, it stuck in our brains for a long time. Here's where I have to fast forward to 22 years later, back in South Minneapolis, as I'm working on a story about Steve Greer. Excuse me, I got to take a drink. I came into the world of ufology in the 90s in the CSETI orbit as a freelance journalist, and I was going to try to get a story placed about Greer's organization and his CE5 initiative, the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative. So as I'm working on the story, I came back from a conference in Fort Collins, Colorado, and the following morning at 4:03 in the morning, I woke up to see 5 little orbs, same size, ping pong style, 5 little red cherry bombs, I call them in the book. And 2 were at the foot of the bed. A third one was adjacent to those. Another one was closest to the window that looked out onto the street. It's the second floor of our house. And the 5th one really got my attention because it seemed to be inside and outside of the room simultaneously. And this really startled me. I looked at the clock again to make sure I was awake and wasn't dreaming or hallucinating, and it was still 4:03 in the morning, and then I was completely shut down. And there were some very interesting, very disturbing residual effects from this that I outlined pretty heavily in chapter 3 of the book. And I'm not going to go into details on those now. It's a pretty involved, long discussion about what these things might have been. And that's one of the mysteries in the book. Here's a spoiler alert. Never really determined, are these some sort of shape-shifting ETs? Are they interdimensional? Were they some sort of supernatural manifestation? And was the one in the park related to the ones in the bedroom 22 years later? So a mystery that's yet to be solved, even though I spend 300 some pages in the Space Pen Club trying to determine exactly the origins of these things. Also, why me twice in a lifetime? And I talked to a lot of very smart intellectual folks in the UFO community about this through the course of the book, and I put their different explanations or understandings about them in the subsequent chapters. Moving to the next slide. This slide really sets up what the title is all about, the Space Pen Club. There really is, or there really was, still is, a real Space Pen Club. It was a kind of tie-dyed Dead Poets Society, if you will. It was founded in my sophomore year up at St. John's University outside of St. Cloud, up in Stearns County. A college friend of mine worked at the college bookstore and came home one day with a Fisher Space Pen and shared it with the guys on the dorm floor. First, it became something of a joke, but then it became rather iconic, and we started building biannual events around it. Peak with the Leaves and Spring Rites. We'd have these interesting parties out at a decommissioned, desanctified chapel at St. John's, about a mile into the woods out on a lake point. And this is a photo from one of those events. As you can see, we had our own little unofficial, official Space Pen flag. Fisher Space Pen Company was started by Paul Fisher about 70 years ago. They're still in existence. They make pens. This was the first pen to write in space, which is something we thought was very cool. And we turned it into kind of a symbolic outline that, for me, represented self-exploration, cosmic consciousness and communication, transcendence, and the occasional quest for beer, girls, tunes, and controlled substances. But seriously, the founder, the guy that we credit with starting the Space Pen Club, Denny, uh, really, really thought the pen represented possibilities. And I think that's parallel to what the whole UFO phenomena represents. It represents a world of possibilities. Um, you know, what would be the reality if we had a firm scientific humanitarian understanding of what these objects are, how they operate, what technologies and other uh, life enhancing devices might they be able to share with us? You know, the possibilities are unlimited. And I think in his very generous endorsement that Dan Aykroyd provided for the book, um, I think he says it best. This is part of a longer endorsement Aykroyd wrote earlier this spring. The Space Pen Club is also an essential read for anyone interested in getting to the truth about one of the greatest mysteries and enigmas in our existence. Who owns these hyper advanced off world aerodynamic platforms? Who controls their obviously intelligent non human operators? And if these things are known to anyone, why can't the technology be shared now? The mechanisms and fuel sources in these crafts could help save our planet and provide basic needs for millions: power, clean water, and climate temperance. And if there's anyone in this forum today that doesn't know who Mr. Aykroyd is, he's the legendary season one member of the Saturday Night Live cast. He was one of the Blues Brothers with John Belushi. He's also a producer and writer who's had a lifelong interest in all things sci, paranormal, and saucer logical. Aykroyd has done a number of TV shows about this, and I obviously was thrilled to get his endorsement. I approached him in November of last year, and in March I got a response. So it was pretty exciting, and I think Dan really articulates, you know, what the possibilities of, or what, you know, once we determine and have a true disclosure about these objects, and whoever pilots them, or from whatever dimensions or other parts of space or the universe that they come from. Moving to slide 7. If you haven't seen the book, these are the chapter titles. There's a rather lengthy prologue that lays out a lot of the themes explored in these chapters. Chapter 1 is the burning pier, the quiet awakening. Relates back to what I thought was really a opening of my consciousness in the 90s prior to meeting Greer. And I had some very strange stuff going on in my house the winter of 1991. And that included some precognitive dreams. It also included the lights coming on for several nights on numerous occasions that my wife and I would always argue about, like, who left the lights on again. And it turned out neither one of us had. They were coming on by themselves. One particular night I woke up and the lights were on, and there was a very weird noise associated, I think, with the lights coming on. It sounded like cat rutting, and so a whole bunch of strange things leading up to meeting Greer, and who talks heavily about the imperative of consciousness in the whole CE5 initiative and in the protocols he uses to quote unquote vector in spacefaring objects from other parts of the universe, and also to do remote viewing. Chapter 2 gets into what that's all about, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. Chapter 3 largely deals with the so-called abduction phenomena, psychotronic nightmares, and the alien abduction blues in this chapter, which gets very technical. I explore the possibility that a lot of the abduction literature and a lot of the experiences that were becoming more and more pronounced during that decade, especially in the mainstream media, that some of these abductions may have been manufactured, may have been carried out by military psyops team, black teams. To me, it's more mind blowing that this is a possible reality than the fact that we're being visited by unknown visitors. So chapter 3 delves into that pretty heavily. Chapter 4, Dragging the Cosmos in Search of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. In this chapter, I discuss how I'm trying to get Steve Greer's story published, and I can't get it published. No mainstream media would touch it. Today, of course, I could have published it in any number of places on the internet. And now in the current media climate we're in, I think there'd be some takers for it. But now, it's 3 or 4 decades old. But in this chapter, I tried to finish the story. I started to talk to people that I'd known in the music business because I had worked in that industry from the late 70s to the 90s, and shared my stories and heard their stories, in particular the one from Owen Husney, who discovered Prince, who had a very dramatic sighting out near Hutchinson one day when he was driving with his fiance. And Owen had no interest in this, as you'll read in this chapter. It wasn't on his radar. But after this incident and then another one several months down the road, he was convinced it was a real thing. He also provided a pretty nice endorsement for the book as well. So in this book, I'm really looking for like-minded individuals, including Tom Talene, who did wonderful research on the Minot Air Force Base case, I think 68. There's a whole website devoted to this. Part of Tom's research ended up on the ABC program with Peter Jennings, I believe. I can't remember the title, but the Minot sighting is pretty dramatic. It was witnessed not only on the ground, but by pilots who were out making their nightly routines, and they spotted the same object over the base. The object not only spooked the hell out of the soldiers on the ground, and also maybe caused them to 2 guys to black out in a Jeep where there were radiation burns on the hood. This object also somehow managed to move the 20-ton block off one of the nuclear missile silos, and not only moved the block, but scrambled the launch codes, which, if you're familiar with, there's been a couple of really good books, including Robert Hastings, I believe, who writes about this, as does Richard Dolan. Similar incidents like this at Maelstrom Air Force Base in Montana, not that far from Minot, really. So there's quite a bit of a discussion here in that chapter about that incident. And then as we move through the rest of it, chapter 5 is information about how the Space Pen Club started, the fellowship that it engendered among college roommates is still vital today, and also the parallels between the club and the UFO community, or the UFO ghetto, as Steve Greer liked to call it, because he liked to distance CSETI from all the craziness that that existed in the UFO community, and I think, not so much these days, but certainly back in the heyday, back in the 90s. Chapter 6 is about my experience getting hypnotized in Arizona by Dr. Richard Haynes from NASA Ames, who was a unpaid advisor to SETI back in the early days of that organization. And under hypnosis, we tried to explore those little red objects that I just discussed earlier. And there was nothing conclusive that came out of it. Another spoiler alert, but there was a fair amount of avoidance on my part. And that's pretty highly detailed in that chapter. Chapter 7 really deals with how the media has addressed this issue. And this particular chapter is called Under the Volcano with CBS's 48 Hours, give or take a day or two. And I need to explain that title. Another title could have easily have been Why the Media Always Gets This Wrong. We had a CBS News crew follow us to Mexico, where there had been an ongoing wave of UFO sightings since the total eclipse there in, I believe, 1990, where while the country was blacked out and people were out with their video cameras everywhere, not in the big cities and out in the rural communities, they were capturing all kinds of UFO activities in the skies, and that activity continues, I think, to this day. Anyway, one of the, excuse me while I have another drink of water. One of the other arms of SETI is its RMIT group, Rapid Mobilization Investigative Team. This is a team of seasoned SETI members who, on fairly short notice, would dispatch to areas where there's either a big wave, like the one in Mexico that we learned about from watching Messengers of Destiny, primarily. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. It's a very interesting collection of the wave in Mexico done by Lee Elders and his wife. Anyway, CBS contacted us, and as we were preparing to go to Mexico, Greer had gone down there a year earlier with 3 or 4 other members, and they had a very dramatic sighting that they thought was going to lead to a landing of a huge triangular object, interacted with them. They shared what Greer likes to call a photon dialogue with the SETI team hitting, signaling with high-powered lights. I understand today they use lasers. And the object signaling back and moving in as if it were going to make an approach to do a landing. Get into quite a bit of detail that was reported in that excursion, that RMIT event in Mexico, prior to traveling down there myself and hooking up with the CBS crew. I say give or take a day or two because the reporter on that story and his producer, Harold Dow, the talent, as they say, and his producer, Claude Becker, did not make it to our site for a complete day. They claimed their car broke down in Puebla, which was roughly 20 miles away. I mean, we don't know why they didn't take a cab or rent another car, but we were with their crew, which they had hired out of Los Angeles, a video guy, cameraman, and a sound guy, and they were with us the first night out, when at about 11:15 in the evening, an object came out of the sky at about 1 o'clock. I noticed it first, and I alerted everybody, and I said to the crew, I said, roll tape, this is the real thing. And I guess I need to explain where we were. This beautiful photo of this volcano It's called Mount Popo, as the locals call it. It's short for a longer Aztec term, which I'm probably going to slaughter here, Mount Popocatépetl. And then there's another volcano that is not active, a few miles to the west of this volcano. But this volcano is the second largest in North America. It's had some serious events where it seemed like it was going to blow entirely, which probably would be devastating for not only the people that live in this area, a lot of the rural farmers and stuff, but also Mexico City, which is less than 100 miles away. Mexico City is built on a dry lake bed. Probably get earthquakes from this thing alone exploding would have devastating impacts on one of the largest cities in the world. Greer was of the opinion that these objects were doing some sort of mitigation activity right inside the volcano. And we actually had a sighting with the CBS crew the second night out, right around the rim of the volcano. It seemed to be playing peekaboo with us right at dusk. And this middle picture here is, whoops, sorry, need to go back to this one, is our group. That's Dr. Greer in the shades to your left, and then Sherry Adamak, who is his right-hand person, and Wayne, whose last name escapes me. He was from Atlanta, a longtime sea-setting member, and then me in the Hawaiian shirt. That's the morning after we had our CE5 close encounter of the fifth kind, and we're waiting for our breakfast at a restaurant that two brothers ran in the area who had their own UFO stories. In fact, quite a few people we met in this part. There's a compound down there in a small city named Metapec, and obviously there's a lot of UFO activity there, and a lot of people we ran into had UFO sightings, both daylight and nighttime. Subsequently, there's been some cameras that have been trained on Mount Popo, and in this bottom image here, you can see a very large cylindrical object apparently heading right into the volcano. There's a video like this you can find on YouTube. I don't know what the hell it is. I wish I did, but it's a fascinating story. Chapter 7 seems to be one of the more favorite chapters of people who've read the book. As again, it really takes on the whole ways in which the media fails to cover this with any seriousness until this recent government report, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. I do quote at length in chapter 7 Terry Hansen's great book. I don't know if you've seen it. It's out of print, but I think you can still buy used copies. It's called The Missing Times: News Media Complicity in the UFO Cover-Up. It's a wonderful book. It's highly researched and annotated, and I quote some of the choice sections of Terry's book about how the poor job media has done in covering this subject. Another interesting chapter in the book is the one that follows 7. This is chapter 8, Star Nations and the UFO Ghetto, live on the res. Standing Elk, who is pictured here now, this is a later day photo of him. He's now been elevated to a chief. He's Chief Golden Light Eagle. He launched the first Star Knowledge Conference in Yankton, South Dakota, in a small town near there called Marty. And UFO researchers from all over the world gathered in this location, and it was the first time that the Native Americans from different tribes were going to share what they knew about this subject. Greer asked me to go and present his presentation because he had a conflict and couldn't make it. So I went down there in his place and delivered my speech, met with a lot of UFO researchers, and unfortunately, I didn't get to spend enough quality time listening to presentations from Standing Elk or by this guy here, John Mack, famous Harvard researcher, psychiatrist who studied the abduction phenomena, almost lost his tenure at Harvard. If you haven't read it, there's a wonderful new biography out written by one of the two reporters that broke the New York Times stories, Ralph Blumenthal, and then also attending the conference was a stigmatist, someone suffering from stigmata, the wounds of Christ, allegedly. This is Giorgio Bongiovanni, who we often refer to as short as Bon Jovi. He has quite a tale to tell. I touched briefly on it in this chapter, but John Mack was fascinated with Giorgio's presentation. In fact, I saw him in the workshop taking copious notes as Giorgio presented his personal story and also his understanding of what the Mexicans call the ovnis, the unknowns. So there were quite a few researchers there, folks whose names you'd recognize: Whitley Strieber, individuals from Britain, Jorge Martin from Puerto Rico. Who else was there? Brazil. I can't think of the guy's name, but they were all pretty much at this conference. You may have seen some of these folks at conferences you've attended. I have to put in another spoiler alert here. On the way out to this conference, just outside of Worthington, probably at 1 in the afternoon, companion and I, who were traveling to the conference, Kevin Foley, who had worked as an advance man for the first Clinton presidential run. He was my traveling companion, and we both noticed a UFA, an unidentified flying arrow, outside the window just after we got into the outskirts of Worthington en route to Marty, South Dakota. It was clear as day. It was set against a blue sky. It was like a chalk arrow. It's like someone had drawn a chalk arrow in the sky. It hung out there parallel to the car, maybe 400 or 500 feet above us. We had two camcorders and two two good cameras with us, and we didn't even think to document it as we were so shaken up by this. I mean, when we first spotted it, we almost went off the road because we were kind of overwhelmed with it. Later at the conference, there was a drumming and chanting session out on the front lawn of the high school where this conference was being held, in a similar chalk circle formed over this group. There were people sitting in a circle, and then a drummer in the center, and a chalk circle appeared above this. I didn't see it. I was stuck inside the high school trying to get out because people were rushing outdoors to try to see this daylight manifestation. Foley was out there, my traveling partner for this was out there, and in fact he ran in to try to get me out there, but the doors were all jammed up with people as word of this circle appeared. This hoop, the natives called it a sacred hoop, appeared in the sky, and again, as I questioned in the book, was this really about ETs, or was this about a bigger spiritual dimension? Was this some kind of spiritual manifestation or sign? I mean, these are the questions that I asked in the throughout the Space Pen Club book, and I'm not sure that I have adequately answered them, but I've certainly hopefully put them into play properly. The final chapters in the book chapters 9 and 10 deal mainly with public disclosure and my search for personal closure. And this is the now infamous cover to the government report that came out from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the preliminary assessment of identified aerial phenomena. I don't know how many people have read the report when it was released. I downloaded it 5 times because I thought my computer had glitched, because I was expecting at least 20 to 70 pages, because I'd read many credible news stories saying, oh yeah, it's going to be 70 pages of documents and graphics and photographs, and it was a whole 9 pages, and terribly disappointing. I'm not going to go into the thoughts I have on it. I do have a blog on the spacepenclub.com website. I'm trying to blog there once a week, and one of my early blogs is about what's in and what's not in the report and general reactions from around the world on it. So I called it a 9-page dud. It wasn't a disclosure at all. It was really, just setting some parameters for more research, which kind of amazing because different parts of the military and government have been studying this since the atomic age. It was pretty bewildering, but I'll say the biggest benefit I think that came out of this report was the tsunami of media coverage that it generated going in the run-up to the release of the report late June. I mean, if you didn't have a good story about UFOs and tic-tac videos that these Navy pilots had were responding to, I mean, you were not in the game. So chapters 9 and 10 look at the public disclosure efforts, not only from this summer, but also the early one that Sept did in 1997 that I was heavily involved with in Washington, D.C. There's some good witness testimony in that from various individuals. And then, of course, excuse me, I discuss at length the 2001 or 2000 disclosure effort that Greer held subsequently at the Washington, D.C. Press Club that was well attended by a couple thousand people and a lot of international media, and got pretty good coverage, but not nearly as much coverage as the run up to the report and then the actual report itself. I quote a lot of good sources in the book, hopefully some of the best material. But one of my favorite quotes, and I think this kind of sums up the dead ends that I may have personally run into in trying to fathom or understand the personal high strangeness things I experienced, and also the broader UFO discussion at large. It was written by JBS Haldane in 1927, almost 100 years ago, who was a British geneticist and evolutionary biologist. And some of you may have seen this quote before. I've seen it in other UFO books. The universe is not only stranger than we suppose, but stranger than we can suppose. And that's pretty much where I leave things. I don't have any strong conclusions other than I'm convinced this planet has been visited for a long time, that we're probably have been surveilled for a long time as we have evolved physically, mentally, perhaps spiritually, and scientifically. Um, we can get into that later in the Q&A, but this quote I really think is a wonderful way to view the universe that we share, and I can't use it enough. This last slide just gives the address of the book's website. It also contains my blog, Martin's Chronicles, and like I said, I'm trying to blog there at least once a week. Try to stay current on information as it comes out. Also doing smaller outtakes of stuff that didn't get into the book, individuals that I wanted to talk about in the book, but I just ended up cutting them, or not writing about them, but they'll be written about in the book. So that's an overview of the book. That's hopefully a good scope of the book. I'm going to quickly read from chapter 9, and then we can open it up for questions. And chapter 9 again is the road to disclosure, the barriers to truth. And this is about let's see. This is about a quarter of the way into the chapter, and I have to set the stage here. In 2017, the New York Times broke this story about the secret UFO study group inside the Pentagon, and then a private sector effort that Robert Bigelow out in Vegas had undertaken with funding to the tune of $22 million through the efforts of Henry Reed providing that funding. So here's where this part of the chapter picks up. I was surprised as anyone in 2017 when Robert Bigelow's name appeared in the covert UAP study and the subsequent media stories, and how millions of taxpayer dollars allegedly had been paid to his team during its time on the program. But the whole thing raised more obvious and downstream questions than answers, like the ones italicized below. The covert study highlights included, quote, the program produced documents that described sightings of aircraft that seemed to move at very high velocities with no visible signs of propulsion, or that hovered with no apparent means of lift, end quote. And in italics, I offer this counterpoint question. So where are they from and who makes them? Another quote from the study, under Mr. Bigelow's direction, the company modified buildings in Las Vegas for the storage of metal alloys and other materials that Mr. Elizondo, the former military intelligence officer who led the secret Pentagon study, and program contractors said had recovered from aerial phenomena, end quote. And then I say, somewhat with a degree of snarkiness, you mean there are recovered parts from these phenomena lying around in a Vegas warehouse, like banged up auto parts at Stan's junkyard? And then another revelation from this study. Quote, researchers also studied people who said they had experienced physical effects from encounters with the objects and examined them for any psychological changes, end quote. By encounters with the objects, are they talking about so-called abduction phenomena, or in polite speak, close encounters of the fourth kind, CE4, a term used by scientific researcher and writer Jacques Vallée in the Journal of Scientific Exploration that built on Dr. Alan Hynek's close encounters terminology. Hynek, the same professor who went from being a professed UFO skeptic to a firm proponent that, quote, there is an embarrassment of riches, end quote, when it comes to evidence on this topic. In a March 2018 New York Magazine interview, Nevada Senator Reed expressed the same perplexed reaction that my best friend Jim and others had to what seemed to be a giant public and governmental shrug of indifference about the news. He asked why the media at large, and the New York Magazine reporter in particular, are not doing its job. Let me give you something that the press has totally failed and conjured, Reed said. We have hundreds and hundreds of pages of paper that have been available since this was completed. Most all of it, 80% of it at least, is public. You know something? The press has never looked at it, not once. That's where we are. I wanted it public. It was made public, and you guys have not even looked at it. So now what? At the time of the story, Stephen Greer from CSETI sensibly tweeted, quote, note that the recent New York Times story is couched from a threat office of the Pentagon. This is a clear ramp up to a false flag fake disclosure designed to prepare people for a threat from outer space, so that the warmongers and profiteers have a new bigger enemy. And then in all caps, Greer tweeted, beware. Greer's 2018 tweet shared glimpses of his longer essay, which is still online, written in 1999. It's called When Disclosure Serves Secrecy. It was so prescient that it seemed incredible it could have been written 20 years earlier. But this was just part of Greer's brilliance, and I saw it repeatedly alongside his equally noticeable foibles and the mountainous ego that often came off as colossal arrogance. I actually didn't mind that, although I worried this Achilles heel could trip him up even as others were doing their best to do so. And I also watched with concern two scenes from two of the three films he has released in the last few years in which he's pictured with a bodyguard. Even more troubling is a 10-second on-screen interview with him, looking like it was crudely spliced into the section for impact, in which he said, and if you're seeing this, it's because I'm either dead or have been entrapped or have disappeared, end quote. But I wondered how he really felt under the public policy pose of the tweet he proffered. After all, he initially set out with an ambitious CSETI disclosure effort beginning in 1993 and peaking in April 2001 with his major disclosure event in Washington at the National Press Club. He and his team were being upstaged by a powerful military institution that routinely hid obscene sums of money in deep black budgets for any number of covert issues with no congressional or presidential oversight. At least he had achieved one of his goals, seeing the UFO subject move from the grocery store tabloids to the front pages of the New York Times. In 2021, other major media are rapidly hurtling toward a more open, less uninformed view of quote unquote the phenomenon. including Jeff Bezos' Washington Post newspaper, perhaps atoning for running crap columns about UFOs like the one I referenced earlier, ridiculing those who wanted an official disclosure by our government. In April 1st, 2021, in an April 1st, 2021 guest column written by Daniel W. Dresner, a professor of international policy at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, Denzer insightfully writes, quote, "The U.S. government continues to tiptoe toward normalization of the idea of identified flying objects, UFOs. The Pentagon went further in August 2020, announcing the establishment of the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force. It is increasingly respectable to acknowledge that unidentified aerial phenomena are a thing. But this leads to a few follow-up questions. Does this evidence point toward the prospect of extraterrestrial observation of our planet? If so, how should we feel about that? I'm not going to speculate on the first question beyond noting that if Harvard astrophysicist, implying Avi Loeb at Harvard, are making that suggestion about interstellar phenomena, perhaps we need to at least consider the possibility that UAPs might be extraterrestrial in origin. If UAPs are extraterrestrial, Dresner writes, this is a different scenario. It is not humans contacting extraterrestrial, but rather those extraterrestrials actively observing us. Furthermore, they seem to be doing so in a way that is not destructive. That is promising. Observation without the intent to destroy suggests a civilization that is much less violent than, say, Spanish conquistadors. Dresner continues, I get the concern from physicists that technologically advanced ETs might behave as powerful human civilizations have in the past. But maybe the concerned physicists should engage a little more with social scientists. The assumption that powerful, technologically advanced civilizations will act in a destructive manner. That is possible, but perhaps civilizations that reward destructive entrepreneurship are less likely to generate the technological wherewithal for interstellar travel. And if these UAPs are ETs, maybe there is more hope for interstellar relations than either scientists or science fiction can envision. That is now, and it has to give the Greers of the realm hope. But with the Times breakthrough then in 2018 through the holidays and into January of that year, I tried to fathom why the public reaction was ultimately such a buzzkill. Putting on my publicist's hat, I reasoned that maybe the Pentagon documents had not been summarized properly so as to make it easier for media and others to wade deeper into deeper waters. Maybe the right reporters had not been contacted. Maybe Bigelow hadn't hired a good PR firm to help with the fallout of the Times headlines. I didn't bother to check if he had. But the most nagging question, like the one Senator Reid raised, was, for subsequent stories, why wasn't the Times looking into all the available detail in the Pentagon report, including information not made available in the overall document? Later stories have gone beyond the reference pilot sightings and reactions to the TikTok images as they've come to be called. That first Times piece got more than 1 million hits online. It made me and my fellow UFO/UAP paranoics suspect that this was a controlled news event of some sort from one of the most influential papers on the planet. Or maybe we were just overthinking it. Perhaps the answer was simpler. Maybe the level of cultural denial and the about the topic was so deep as to be blinding. The layers of tinfoil too dense to peel back and even relevant and seem relevant to the average American who had more challenges to face, like how to make a living. The public's mute button had been pushed in deep and was not going to be released anytime soon, especially as the era of fake news, pathologically ushered in by Trump and the reported widespread interference of Russian hackers and others online, became more culturally pronounced. So that's all I'm going to read from that chapter. And with that, I'll take another swig of water, and I guess we can open it up to questions.
Hi, Martin. Two questions. You had mentioned something about I think you said Avery Club. Was it Avery or Aviary?
Aviary.
Aviary?
Yeah.
Okay, and where can I find out more about that?
Just Google aviary. All these guys have nicknames like Penguin, Chickadee, Chicken Little. Uh, one of the shortcomings of my book in talking about the aviary, I never really got into how this group was formed or why they took on these bird names, but people in the UFO community at large always referred to them as kind of the bad guys and maybe the possible management team behind the whole subject area. I had quite a few interactions with the guy that was nicknamed Chicken Little, who apparently was good friends with Pelican, who was really the who allegedly headed the UFO Weird Desk, as they called it, the desk that handled all of the UFO reports that the CIA was privy to. It's a it's a colorful group of guys, some very well placed folks from industry, aerospace, and other disciplines.
Okay, thank you very much. The second question I had was you had mentioned, I think you said Martin Hastings and Richard Dolan published something about the 1968 Minot incident. Was that Martin Hastings?
No, it's Robert Hastings, and
Robert.
and they refer to the Minot incident. I don't think they get into as much research as Tom Talene did, and his research is all online. Just Google Minot Air Force Base research, Tom Talene, Tulien, I think is the spelling of his last name. It's a fascinating report. Tom does really good work. And Dolan and Hastings just touch on this. Hastings' book is much more current. Dolan's, I think, 3 volumes, UFOs and the National Security State. He gets into all these incursions at nuclear missile sites, and he does really good work too. I mean, everything's highly footnoted, annotated, etc.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to mute everybody, but Martin, I'll unmute you in a second too. Then we got our next question coming up from Joe, so hang on. So Martin, your request is to be unmuted. It came through, and we got our next question from Joe Swenson. I'm sending you a request to unmute yourself, Joe, so you two can be the next question.
Oh, I can't unmute.
Yep. Well, I unmuted you, so yeah. And now, Martin, did you unmute yourself or no? Looks like.
I think so. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
you're good. Yep.
Yeah.
So Joe, take it away.
The U.S. Navy in 2004 released patent number 1014453 2B which was of their TR-3B, and there had been a rash of subsequent prior art patents released to that. Now that's a triangular UFO. Now, I originally saw Sikorsky's patent on this in 1963, and he demoed a working model for Popular Mechanics of that year. And then suddenly he had a helicopter company manufacturing helicopters for the armed services, and it all stopped. But what my question is in that 2004 patent release, I think they have something much better than that now.
Well, if I could speak to that, I probably wouldn't be trying to hawk my UFO book, but I don't know. I've heard from reliable sources, including Greer, that we've had anti-gravity craft since the 50s, that the reverse engineering on these downed objects has been fairly extensive, and that they're operational, and that we also have a line of what's called alien reproductive vehicles. I think it's ARV is the acronym I see all the time. I think those are active. I think a lot of UFO sightings may be the ones that we have, but it always begs the question, where did the technology come from? And of course, if you read Phil Corso's controversial book, and you read some of the other experts on this, it's a foregone conclusion that most of the stuff that have the capabilities of some of the real things are in fact gleaned from the technology of crashed ET vehicles.
Yeah. 2004, they also released through Wright-Patterson Air Force Base a document on teleportation. And I remember the formula that they were using from 1972 when I was in. But that would be relating more toward your Tic Tac being an upgrade from the TR-3B.
Yeah, I know Greer pretty strongly believes that Tic Tac stuff is probably ours, and it's being used for propaganda purposes. It's to set up the threat analysis in the public awareness. I do want to read a quote that Whitley Strieber unearthed, and when this government report came out, Strieber's blog, and I don't know if anybody follows that at unknowncountry.com. Strieber's a great writer and a really good thinker, and of course he has his communion experiences as he described them. Strieber pretty much shrugged earlier this summer. He said, well, you know, what's the big deal? The Pentagon admitted UFOs were, quote, not of this world 74 years ago in a 1947 classified memo from General Nathan Twining, which was later released under the Freedom of Information Act document, quote, stating that the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. Twining went on to describe the, quote, extreme rates of climb and other characteristics that precisely match the recorded capabilities of the objects in the recently released naval footage earlier this summer. So, yeah, we're a very, very interesting period in this. I think goes without saying, but I said it anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I don't see anyone's hand raised either. So, got a question?
Somebody's got a question in there. Paul's got a question.
Oh, really? Okay.
And you're on mute, Paul.
So I just sent her for Paul Fleming. I just sent her an unmute request. So
He's on mute.
So I sent a request for him to unmute himself. He has to go ahead and unmute himself.
All right. I do see a question in the chat that says, regarding the Minot events, where did you get the info on the 2 airmen passed out and the movement of the lid on the silo? That's from Tom Tlee's research.
Bill McNeff, did you want me to unmute Bill so he can? Yeah, I'm sending a request to unmute Bill in case he's got a question too. Bill, I sent a request to unmute you. Oh, he just unmuted, so take it away, Bill.
Okay. Yes, my question was, I didn't quite get your answer as to where you got the information about the 2 airmen passing out and the movement of the lid on the silo.
That was from Tom Tlee's research, which you can find online, although I quote it pretty extensively in the book in chapter 4.
Okay. Good. I've looked at the account online, and as a matter of fact, I had something to do with that. I furnished the radar scope photos that were taken on the B-52.
Tom loves radar data.
Yes.
One thing I've learned about him. In fact, he wanted me to proofread a chapter he's contributing to somebody's new book on use of radar data, UFOs.
But how much was the lid on top of the silo disturbed? I didn't find that in Tom Tulene's account, and it's just because I haven't read enough of it, I guess.
Well, I'm pretty sure it's in there. If not, I may have found it in another source, but I mean, it was enough to expose, an open silo.
Yes. Okay, good. Because I had heard that before and wasn't able to confirm it. So I'm glad to hear you confirm both of those items. Thank you.
I'm going to try to unmute Paul Fleming again to see if he's still got his question. So Paul, I sent you a request to unmute yourself.
All right.
Okay, now we hear you. Yep, we hear you.
Yes. When I was in Vietnam, I was told I had bomb dump guard duty. I said, what? And the bomb dump is huge. That was a Friday. And then Saturday morning at 0300 hours, we were hit with incoming. And I called the captain, and he said, I don't hear anything. And I said, sir, no, you're 28 miles away and 4,000 feet up. Well, what happened was it stopped. However, Monday morning, the bomb dump began exploding. It exploded for 3 days. It leveled Da Nang. You know how many people were hurt? Zero. It leveled Da Nang. Do you know who Frank Joseph is? He has a book called Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials. They exploded the bomb dump, and no one was hurt.
Wow, I'm not
Yes.
familiar with that story. That's a hell of a good story.
Yes, and no one was hurt. It leveled Da Nang, leveled it, and no one was hurt. Oh, excuse me. Yes, a Vietnamese national was hit with shrapnel, and they couldn't get him to medical assistance in time, and he bled to death. But no military were hurt.
How recent was that book?
That I think it's 2018. Frank Joseph Bear publication, 2018. Yeah, Bear.
I'll look into that.
Yeah, and when I was a little boy, I'm lying in my crib. I wasn't even quite 2 years old, and I had these clowns looking down at me. I thought they were clowns, but they weren't. Yeah. This has happened through me all through my life. All through my life. 2009, I was hunting up at Bowman Lake, and I had 2 Sasquatch scream at me, and I picked up my rifle and I got the heck out of Dodge. That I sleep on the 3rd floor, and I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and there were 3. I'm sitting now on the 2nd floor in my bed, and there were 3 grays right in my room, and I could hear what they were saying. They said, "We're done with him for now," and they went right through the wall. right through the
Yet
wall.
it seems people that have had one encounter with what I call radical reality
You know,
have,
I took a,
have several they have
Martin,
several encounters through their life, and looking back, I have the same experience, but I hesitate to say, well, this is all about ET, because I don't know. I can't say conclusively it is.
Martin, hello?
Yeah.
I took a psychological evaluation designed by Dr. Paul Arbisi in April of 2017. 376 questions. He graded it the next day, called me and he said, "Why are you here? You don't have PTSD and you are not, you're no bullshitter. You don't make things up."
You're not crazy.
Yeah. And I said, well, then I wouldn't make a very good politician, would I? But no, I don't lie. My dad said, if you lie, you're going to have to tell another lie and then another lie after that. And by the time you're through, you'll forget what the first lie was. So I don't lie. But,
So Dean de Hartport has a question. So I'm going to send a request to unmute Dean. So Dean, you can unmute yourself. And if you don't, I'll read the question for you, but I'll give you the opportunity to ask the question yourself. So I just sent you that request, Dean. And he's still muted. Well, Dean's question is, why doesn't the press? Oh, he's unmuted. Go ahead, Dean.
Yes, can you tell me what you think about why the press doesn't follow up on the information that Bigelow has crashed remains of UFOs in his possession in some warehouse in Las Vegas? I would think the press would want to make a big deal out of that.
Well, that's a great question, and I've seen some discussion on that as to why they will or won't. The press has a lot of catching up to do on this topic, especially in the mainstream press. I've never met any mainstream journalists that have read even 10 pages in any good UFO book, or any bad UFO book for that matter. I don't know, if I had more time and resources, I would be going through those papers, and hopefully that evidence that's sitting out in Bigelow's warehouses out there that he's customized. It's perplexing, but the press in large part is controlled by the corporate owners who they, I'm not going to say they dictate what gets coverage, but they watch closely what gets coverage. And I think what General Electric, who owns MSNB? Oh, Microsoft owns them, but a lot of these big corporations are supposed to be hands off on this, but if they have any sort of black projects they've done with the government, they're not going to disclose that, and they're not going to press their editors to chase news like this. But that's a great question, and I'd like to have a face-to-face conversation with Bigelow about that, and try to gain access.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Dean. So we got a little more time left. We probably got time for one more question max. So you can either throw it in the chat box or raise your hand and I'll unmute you. But let us know if we got another question for Martin Keller. Seeing none. No more questions. No more questions. Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, Paul's raising his hand. I'll unmute you, Paul, but that's not the hand raising I was looking for. So yeah, okay. So unmuting Paul. So the request has been sent. You got to unmute yourself, Paul, though.
All right.
Oh, there you go.
I've been to Malmstrom Air Force Base in 2009. In 67, Malmstrom and Great Falls, Montana. In 67, 4 UFOs depleted all the plutonium in all of the missiles. I was there in 2009, and on the second day, I was there for 3 days. I went over to a guard and I said, how many magazines do you carry for your M16 and how many rounds in each? And the guard said, sir, none. No weapons had any ammunition for them. They said this is all just for show. So I know that we'll never be attacked by a nuclear war. Ever. Ever.
I hope you're right.
No, I am right. I am right. I've seen it for myself. When the bomb dump blows up for 3 days and no one's hurt. Being protected.
I know Dan Sheehan, I don't know how many are familiar with him, the public policy lawyer, helped litigate the Pentagon Papers, Karen Silkwood case, Wounded Knee, Iran-Contra. Well, it turns out Sheehan has a lifelong interest in UFOs. He wrote a classified research paper for Jimmy Carter, who we all know had his famous, well-publicized sighting prior to becoming president. Sheehan made some interesting comments in June on Grant Cameron's podcast out of Winnipeg, which I highly recommend. Grant does good work. He seems to know everybody, but in the field, and Sheehan made some interesting comments as people were sort of setting the stage for what or what wouldn't be covered in this government document that came out in late June. And Sheehan made the observation that in all of the close encounter of the fourth kind cases that he'd read or that he'd vetted, and all of the ones that he trusted, he said that the interactions with humans and ETs generally resulted in two key messages time and again through the decades. Number one, get rid of your nuclear weapons. They're not just a threat to you and the planet, but they're a threat to us and space. Number two, your planet is collapsing environmentally. You need to start addressing this, or it's going to be game over for you. And I don't know how many people have seen the recent UN report on climate, but the report basically declared a code red for the planet Earth. So we need to take some drastic measures to quit loading carbon into the atmosphere and get on a solar, wind, and diet, if you will. Although Steve Greer likes to talk about the hell with solar and wind, there's 0 point energy which these vehicles use. He says that's the energy supply that we need to have, and it needs to be provided to countries across the globe. But I think that's a pipe dream. But